The winter of 1842 was the kind that seemed to gnaw straight through bone and marrow. Dyer's Hollow, a small settlement carved from the frost-bitten woods of Maine, lay buried under a quilt of snow so deep it silenced the land. The wind didn't just howl here. It screamed, sharp as splintered glass, carrying with it the scents of pine sap, frozen earth, and the faint metallic tang of wood smoke. Days were short, nights longer still, and in between lay a cold that didn't merely chill, it judged. Life in the hollow was a bargain struck with nature. The men swung axes in the bitter dawn, cutting firewood to last through storms that could swallow whole weeks. Women churned butter in kitchens dim with candlelight, sewing patches over patches until the clothes themselves became a kind of stitched history. Children carried pails of water from the half-frozen stream, each trip a careful dance over treacherous ice. There was no luxury of choice, only the endless negotiation for survival. The people here were bound not just by blood and marriage, but by the knowledge that the outside world was weeks away by sleigh or wagon, and that in the dead of winter it might as well be on another continent. Isolation had carved them into something different from the townsfolk of Portland or Bangor. It had made them suspicious, watchful, some would say, haunted. Superstition was the unspoken mortar holding the place together. Every hearth had its iron charms against the old cold, a spirit said to wander the woods, freezing any soul foolish enough to meet its gaze. Bread was baked with salt in the corners, not for flavor, but to keep away whispering hunger, a sickness the elders claimed had once taken a whole family in a single night. Few spoke openly of such things, but everyone acted as if they were true. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from, because, see, in Dyer's Hollow, it was understood that the living and the dead shared the same roads, and that some doors once opened could never be closed again. On the village's edge stood the Dyer house, 3 stories of weathered timber with an attic window like a single unblinking eye. It had been there longer than anyone could say, its beams blackened not by time, but by some older shadow that clung like frost to every nail and plank. In winter, when snow buried its steps and ice framed its eaves, it looked less like a home and more like a warning. No one in the hollow would admit to fearing it. Yet, when the wind came from the north and rattled its shingles like teeth, shutters would close just a little faster, and candles would burn just a little longer. The Dyers were, on the surface, a family of good standing. In a village where every man's worth was measured in calluses and every woman's in her ability to keep a hearth burning through a blizzard, the Dyers had both respect and means. Their patriarch, Elias Dyer, was a man of deep voice and deeper scripture, a deacon at the small clapboard meeting house who could quote entire passages of the Old Testament without glancing at a page. His wife, Mercy, was equally devout, her presence in the pews a figure of perfect posture and eyes lowered in piety. They were known for their charity, or at least that is what the town called it. For years the Dyer home had opened its heavy oak door to children with no place else to go, the ones left motherless by childbirth, fatherless by the sea, or entirely abandoned on the steps of the church during winter storms. While most families in the hollow could scarcely feed their own, Elias and Mercy took in these strays without complaint, clothing them in wool, feeding them from their own stores. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from, because wham! While the hollow praised this generosity aloud, behind closed doors it stirred a quieter conversation. It was not the fact of the charity that unsettled some, but the scale of it. Other households might take in 1 orphan, perhaps 2, and even then only until the child was old enough to work. But the Dyers had taken in many. The exact number was uncertain. Some claimed a dozen over the years, others swore it was closer to 20. The children came in thin and pale, yes, but they did not stay that way. Well-fed, well-clothed, they could be seen working about the property, splitting kindling, tending the garden in the warmer months. And then they would vanish. No one could say when they left, or to where. Elias, when asked, would smile in that deliberate way of his and speak of opportunities in Boston, or apprenticeships with distant cousins. His tone was always calm, always reasonable. But there were no letters from these children, no sightings in neighboring towns, no travelers bringing news of them. Still, in a place where winter could kill as surely as hunger, questioning generosity too loudly was a dangerous thing. A man's reputation could be as brittle as ice, and no one wished to find themselves unwelcome when the snow came heavy. And so, the Dyers remained pillars of the community, upright, devout, unfaltering in their hospitality. Yet, beneath the polite smiles and Sabbath greetings, the hollow carried a shared, unspoken thought. Some houses have doors that open too easily and close too quietly. The attic of the Dyer house was unlike any other in the hollow. Most families kept their uppermost rooms for storage. Crates of salted fish, sacks of flour, broken furniture awaiting repair. But in the Dyer home, the attic had been transformed into a dormitory. 19 narrow beds, each with its own quilted coverlet, stood in 2 long rows beneath the sloped roof, the air heavy with the mingled scents of pine boards and the faint sweetness of oil lamp smoke. The beams overhead creaked with every gust of wind, as though the house itself groaned under the weight of the winter sky. Frost would lace the small square windows by nightfall, patterns forming like white spider webs across the glass. On the coldest evenings, the frost would creep inward, feathering along the inside of the panes so that the children could trace their names in it with numb fingers. A single lamp burned low at the far end of the room, its flame trapped behind a globe of wavy glass. It gave the space a dim, honey-colored glow that never reached the far corners, leaving pockets of shadow where the roof dipped low. The floorboards were worn smooth by small bare feet, but they whispered and popped with the temperatures shifting, making it sound as if someone were always moving up here, even when every child was still. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from, because the nightly routines in this place were not like those in other homes. At sunset, the children were expected to be in bed, not just upstairs but under their quilts lying flat, hands visible on the blanket's edge. Elias would walk the narrow aisle between the beds, oil lamp in hand, his boots making slow, measured steps. He would pause at each bed, speaking softly from the Psalms, his voice steady, almost lulling. Mercy followed behind, her eyes darting quickly to each child's face as if counting them. The rules were simple yet peculiar. No speaking after the lamp was lowered, no leaving one's bed for any reason, not for water, not for the privy, not for the comfort of a blanket from another cot. If a child was cold, they were to bear it. If they could not sleep, they were to lie still and silent until morning light crept in. The attic door was shut each night from the outside, the latch clicking into place with a sound that seemed far louder in the darkness, and though no one spoke of it, the children knew. Once that latch was drawn, no footsteps would be heard coming up the stairs again until the following dawn. In the attic of the Dyer house, silence was demanded, but whispers had a way of... Children swore they had seen him kneel there late at night, lamp burning low, his hands working at the lock. No one had ever heard it open, yet more than one child claimed to have woken to find it shifted just a little from where it had been the day before. The bravest among them had dared to touch it. The wood was always cold, colder than the air in the room, as if it held the winter inside it. And if you pressed your ear to the side, you could sometimes hear something. Not scratching this time, but a slow, deliberate movement, like cloth dragging over wood. None of them ever told Elias or Mercy. They didn't need to. Everyone in that attic knew there were some questions you didn't ask, and some lids you didn't lift. The last day began like any other, at least that is what most of the hollow claimed at first, but when they spoke of it later, the details shifted. The ordinary was threaded with something harder to name. The morning was bitter cold, the kind that stung the eyes and set breath hanging in the air like smoke. From the meeting house steps, Ruth Phelps recalled seeing the Dyer children walking in pairs toward the frozen stream, carrying small pails. "Quiet," she said. "Too quiet. Even the little ones didn't chatter." Normally, their voices would carry across the snow, but that morning, they moved as if under a spell. At the Dyer house, Mercy was seen hanging laundry despite the frost, the thin garments stiffening almost instantly in the air. Widow Alcott swore she saw her staring not at the sheets, but at the woods beyond, eyes fixed and unblinking. Elias, for his part, was in the village square, trading salted cod for lamp oil. Jonah Marks, the storekeeper, remembered how the man counted his coins twice, slowly, as though listening for something. Didn't look at me once, Jonah said. Not once. Just kept glancing at the window, like he expected someone or something to appear. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from, because the most unsettling reports came from the children themselves. Near midday, 3 of the older boys were spotted by the old blacksmith shed. They weren't playing. No snowballs, no games. Just standing there, heads together, murmuring. When old Hiram Bell called to them, they turned in unison and stared for a long moment before walking away without a word. Later, Hiram said their eyes looked wrong, like they'd been awake too long, or dreaming with their eyes open. By afternoon, the sky had begun to grey with the promise of snow. The younger children were herded back inside by Mercy, who clapped her hands sharply, the sound cutting through the still air. No one saw them after that, no one except the Dyers. Inside, lamps were lit earlier than usual. Through the frost-filmed windows, neighbors glimpsed shapes moving upstairs. Some swore they heard a low, droning hymn, sung slow and deep, though no one could place the words. The sound carried strangely in the cold, flattening the notes into something hollow. By nightfall, a sharp wind had risen, rattling shutters and sweeping snow across the roads. The Dyer house stood with its attic window glowing faintly, the single unblinking eye over the hollow. Then, as the first flakes began to fall, the light went out. It began as a whisper in the trees, the faint rustle of wind through pine needles, a sound so ordinary no one in the hollow thought to mark it. By midnight, that whisper had turned to a low, constant roar, the kind of wind that pushes against the walls and makes the chimney moan like a voice in pain. Snow came next, not in gentle flakes, but in hard, stinging bursts that slapped against the windows and clung to the panes in uneven sheets. The Dyer house, standing at the northern edge of the ville, Largo, was the first to feel the full force. The wind there came unbroken from the ridge, dragging with it curtains of snow so thick the road, finding cracks to slip through. Beneath the quilts, when Elias's footsteps faded down the stairs and Mercy's shadow vanished from the doorway, the children would inch their faces toward one another, speaking in voices so faint they barely stirred the air. These were not the innocent bedtime tales of other households. The stories passed between these beds were of things that moved in the night, things the grown folk would never believe. It was always the same corners, the 2 farthest from the lamplight, where shapes seemed to gather. At first they were just shadows, harmless tricks of the low glow, but the longer you stared, the less they seemed to belong to the furniture or the slant of the roof. The older children swore they saw them shift, slow and deliberate, as if listening. Then there was the scratching, not loud but steady, like nails dragging lightly across the inside of the walls. Some said it came from mice, others whispered it was something trying to get in or out. The sound was worse in winter, when the frost seemed to seal the attic from the rest of the world. Lying there in the dark, it was impossible to tell if it was behind the wall or beneath the bed. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from, because the most whispered story of all was about the chest. It sat in the narrow alcove beneath the north window, its lid bowed slightly with age, the iron lock heavy and blackened. No one knew what was inside. Mercy said it held winter blankets and old clothes. Elias said nothing at all, but the children swore they had seen him kneel there late at night, lamp burning low, his hands working at the lock. No one had ever heard it open, yet more than one child claimed to have woken to find it shifted, just a little, from where it had been the day before. The bravest among them had dared to touch it. The wood was always colder than the air in the room, as if it held the winter inside it, and if you pressed your ear to the side you could sometimes hear something. Not scratching this time, but a slow, deliberate movement, like cloth dragging over wood. None of them ever told Elias or Mercy. They didn't need to. Everyone in that attic knew there were some questions you didn't ask, and some lids you didn't lift. In the attic of the Dyer house, silence was demanded, but whispers had a way of finding cracks to slip through. Beneath the quilts, when Elias's footsteps faded down the stairs and Mercy's shadow vanished from the doorway, the children would inch their faces toward one another, speaking in voices so faint they barely stirred the air. These were not the innocent bedtime tales of other households. The stories passed between these beds were of things that moved in the night, things the grown folk would never believe. It was always the same corners, the two farthest from the lamplight, where shapes seemed to gather. At first they were just shadows, harmless tricks of the low glow, but the longer you stared, the less they seemed to belong to the furniture or the slant of the roof. The older children swore they saw them shift, slow and deliberate, as if listening. Then there was the scratching, not loud, but steady, like nails dragging lightly across the inside of the walls. Some said it came from mice. Others whispered it was something trying to get in, or out. The sound was worse in winter when the frost seemed to seal the attic from the rest of the world. Lying there in the dark, it was impossible to tell if it was behind the wall or beneath the bed. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from, because the most whispered story of all was about the chest. It sat in the narrow alcove beneath the north window, its lid bowed slightly with age. The iron lock heavy and blackened. No one knew what was inside. Mercy said it held winter blankets and old clothes. Elias said nothing at all, but vanished before dawn. By morning, the hollow had become a series of small white islands, each home sealed within its own drifted walls. The path to the Dyer place was gone entirely, buried beneath waist-high drifts that hardened like stone in the cold. No one would be making that walk today. No one would be coming to call. Inside, the isolation pressed close. The windows were all but blind with frost, their edges crusted in a rim of ice so thick it blurred the light into a dull glow. The air was heavy with the smell of burning pine and oil lamps, the kind of heat that warms the skin but never reaches the bone. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from, because this was the kind of storm that made people in Dyer's Hollow believe the old superstitions. In storms like this, the elders said, you weren't merely cut off from the world, you were hidden from it. Paths disappeared, landmarks vanished, and the woods crept closer, their black trunks crowding the edges of the whiteness. Something about the wind carried more than snow. It carried a pressure, a listening. Neighbors would later admit that none of them slept well that night. The wind rose and fell in strange intervals, almost rhythmic, as if circling the village. More than one household claimed they heard knocking, faint, deliberate, at their shutters, only to find nothing there when they dared look. For the Dyer home, the storm was worse. It sat exposed on its rise of land, the snow curling up over its porch like a white tide. The front door was buried to the lintel, the back to the hinges. Even if anyone inside had wanted to leave, they could not have done so without digging their way out. And in the rising wind, that would have been a death sentence. By the time night fell again, the storm had sealed the hollow in its grip. Whatever was inside the Dyer house would stay inside. The storm had broken by evening, but the air it left behind was stranger still. The snow lay heavy and untouched, smooth as porcelain, glistening faintly under a sky the color of deep slate. The wind had gone entirely, leaving a silence so complete it seemed to press against the ears. In Dyer's Hollow, such calm after a storm was never trusted. The old folks said it was listening weather, the kind that waits and watches. The Dyer house stood against this stillness like a lone ship in an empty sea. Its dark timbers were etched in frost, its roofline glistening where ice had formed a jagged crown. No footprints marked the snow around it, not even the prints of a stray dog or rabbit. It was as though the house had been set apart, untouched by life. That night, the air carried an odor, faint but unmistakable. Sarah Cutter, walking back from her sister's home with a lantern in hand, later swore she smelled it halfway down the road from the Dyer place. Not the clean scent of pine smoke, nor the acrid tang of coal, but something sweeter, heavier, like candles burning in a closed room. She said it caught in her throat and left a taste like old pennies. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from, because what Sarah saw next stayed with her until the day she died. The attic window, the high single-pane eye that stared over the hollow, was lit. Not brightly, but with a faint, wavering glow, as though a lamp inside was struggling to stay alive. She could see shadows moving past it, not in hurried steps, but in slow, deliberate passes. First one figure, then another, crossing before the glass. The light dimmed, then flared, as if someone were shielding it with their hands and then releasing it again. Sarah paused, listening. No voices, no sound of movement, just the faint creak of timbers carrying across the cold. Then, from somewhere, she couldn't say if it was inside the house or from the very air, came a single, dull thump, like a chest being closed, followed by a long, dragging scrape. She stood there for another minute, clutching her lantern, until the cold bit through her boots and drove her onward. When she turned back, the attic light had gone out. By morning, the 19 beds in that room would be empty. But for now, the Hollow slept, unaware that it was the last night those children would ever be seen. The sun rose pale and distant, a weak disk struggling through a gauze of high, frozen clouds. In the Hollow, mornings after a storm were marked by the sound of shovels scraping paths, doors groaning open, and boots crunching over the crusted snow. But that morning, the Dyer house remained silent. It was Ruth Phelps who first noticed. She had stepped outside to fetch kindling and saw that no smoke rose from the Dyer's chimney, an odd thing given the bitter cold. She watched the house for a time, expecting to see Elias emerge with his shovel or one of the older boys come to fetch water from the stream. But no one came. By mid-morning, concern had grown into unease. Jonah Marks and Hiram Bell made the trudge through the drifts toward the house, their boots breaking through the hard crust with every step. As they reached the porch, they saw it. The snow around the Dyer home lay unbroken. No prints from the night before, no tracks leaving or arriving. The drifts pressed right up against the front door, undisturbed. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from, because what they found inside would trouble the Hollow for generations. The door creaked open under Jonah's hand, the hinges stiff with cold. Inside, the air was still and heavy, carrying a faint, sweet smell neither man could place. The downstairs rooms were orderly. A pot of water sat on the stove, frozen solid on its surface. The table was set for breakfast, bowls and spoons laid neatly but untouched. It was Hiram who noticed the attic door. The latch was drawn back. Slowly they climbed the narrow stairs, each step protesting with a long groan. The air grew colder as they ascended, their breath fogging in the dim light. At the top, the dormitory lay before them, 19 beds in 2 perfect rows. Each was neatly made, quilts smoothed flat, pillows plumped, as though waiting for their occupants to return. But there were no children. Not a shoe, not a doll, not a discarded scrap of clothing to suggest a hurried departure. Jonah crossed to the window. Outside, the snow stretched smooth and unbroken to the tree line. "They didn't walk out," he said, his voice low. "No one did." By the time they returned to the village, the whispers had already begun. Words like vanished and taken slid through the air, each quieter than the last, as though speaking them too loudly might invite the same fate. Some blamed the storm, others weren't so sure the storm had left at all. By midday, the Hollow had gathered in the meeting house yard. Word of the Dyer children's disappearance had traveled fast, carried on breathless knocks at doors and hurried whispers in frozen streets. Elias and Mercy were nowhere to be seen, their absence a fact that many noticed but none dared to speak of yet. Lanterns were lit, their flames flickering in the pale daylight as men checked and rechecked their oil. The Hollow's few hunting dogs were brought forward, their noses pressed into the quilts taken from the attic beds. The animals sniffed, whined, then backed away with low, uneasy growls. The plan was simple. Fan out from the Dyer home in a wide circle, comb every drift, every copse of trees, every hollow in the land where 19 small bodies might be found. Hiram Bell, at 71, took the southern stretch toward the old mill. Jonah Marks led the largest group north toward the ridge, where the storm had piled the snow into great jagged dunes. Others moved west toward the frozen St. Ream, lanterns swaying in the still air. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from, because what they found, or didn't, unsettled even the most practical among them. The snow was untouched, everywhere. Even in the open fields where the wind might have swept tracks away, there was no sign of disturbance. Beneath the pines where the snow lay in softer, shadowed mounds, there were no small impressions, no broken branches, no scraps of cloth caught in the bark. The frozen stream bore no sign of anyone crossing. The dogs, urged forward again and again, refused to lead. They pulled against their leashes, whining, some refusing to step beyond the Dyer yard. Old Thomas Greeley swore one of them lay down in the snow and trembled until its master carried it away. As the light began to fade, the lanterns took on a more urgent glow, bobbing like fireflies against the encroaching dusk. The men moved slower now, their shouts growing fewer. It was not just the cold that gnawed at them. It was the creeping certainty that they were searching for something that had left no path to follow. By nightfall, they returned to the meeting house with nothing. Not a print, not a shred of fabric, not even the faintest trace of where 19 children might have gone. It was then, in the uneasy quiet of the gathered crowd, that someone finally said aloud what many had already begun to think. They didn't walk away from that house. The chest had stood in the attic's north alcove for as long as anyone could remember. A hulking thing of dark, warped wood, its iron bands pitted with rust, the lock black and stubborn. The searchers had ignored it at first, their eyes and lanterns drawn to the empty beds, the perfect rows, the frost-furred windows. But as the hours passed and the silence in that attic pressed tighter, someone, Jonah Marks by most accounts, laid a hand on the lid. It was cold. Colder than the air. They fetched a crowbar from the tool shed. The lock resisted, groaning like something in pain, until finally it gave with a snap that echoed against the rafters. The lid lifted slowly, its hinges grinding, the smell rising from within thick and metallic, cut through with something sweet, the same scent Sarah Cutter had spoken of the night before. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from, because what lay inside stopped every voice in that room. The chest was not filled with blankets, as Mercy had once claimed. It was lined in rough, unbleached linen, stiff with some long-dried residue. Inside were 19 small bundles, each wrapped tightly in cloth, tied with thin cord. The bundles were uniform in size, about the length of a forearm, and each bore a small scrap of paper pinned to it, marked with a single number in ink, 1 through 19. The men stood frozen, their breath clouding in the cold air. Jonah knelt and untied one. Inside, wrapped in another layer of fabric, lay a child's shoe, well made but worn. In some, there were small toys carved from wood, a ribbon, a book with its pages warped from damp. One held a lock of hair, tied neatly with thread. Each bundle was the same. A single belonging, preserved and hidden away. No bodies. No blood, no sign of violence. Just the careful, deliberate keeping of things that should have been in use, not sealed away in a chest. The weight of it settled over them slowly. These were not mere keepsakes. They were records, memorials, or warnings. When the chest was emptied, they found nothing beneath the linen except a thin scattering of salt across the bottom boards, pressed deep into the grain as if it had been there for years. The lid was closed again, but no one replaced the lock. It sat gaping in the dim light of the attic, its emptiness somehow heavier than when it had been full, and in that stillness more than one man swore they heard faint scratching from inside the wall. As the town hall of Ashwick was never meant to hold such a crowd, on that brittle January morning the benches groaned under the weight of nearly every able-bodied man and woman from miles around. The air was heavy with the mingled smells of wet wool, wood smoke, and something less tangible, fear sharpened into suspicion. At the front, a long table was set for the town council, their faces pale and drawn from lack of sleep. The Dyer parents sat stiffly to one side, Mrs. Dyer's gloved hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had blanched white. Across from them, townsfolk whispered into cupped hands, eyes darting between the grieving couple and the heavy wooden door that led outside, as though expecting something, or someone, to burst through. The testimonies began with the simplest. Farmers, mill workers, neighbors recounting what they had seen and heard in the days leading up to the disappearance. Mrs. Hargrave, the postmistress, swore she had seen a pale-faced boy watching her from the attic window 2 days before the storm, a boy she didn't recognize among the Dyer children. Then came Silas Bell, the trapper who had passed the Dyer property the night of the disappearance. His voice trembled as he claimed to have seen lights flicker in the attic, not the steady glow of an oil lamp, but a stuttering pulse, like lightning behind walls. He admitted he had hurried past, the hairs on his neck rising, though no thunder followed. Others gave stranger accounts. A young girl, Martha Trill, whispered that one of the missing children, a boy named Caleb, had told her of the man in the beams who whispered to him when he couldn't sleep. An older man, Elias Brooks, claimed to have heard, above the howling wind that night, a sound like a dozen small voices singing in a language he could not place. But not all voices agreed. Samuel Pike, a stern-faced deacon, insisted there was nothing unnatural here, only the result of negligence, perhaps worse. He accused the Dyers of mistreating the children, his words igniting murmurs of agreement from those who had always found the family's charitable zeal to be more self-serving than saintly. The meeting grew heated. Voices rose, fingers pointed. The Dyers maintained their innocence, yet their answers were clipped, their eyes avoiding certain questions. Outside, snow still lay unbroken around their home, sealing the impossibility of any normal explanation. By the time the council adjourned, one thing was certain. The town was no longer united in grief, but splintered into factions, those who believed the Dyers were hiding something, and those who feared something far worse had come to Ashwick and was not yet finished. The church was fuller than it had been in years, though not from devotion. People came for answers, for comfort, for some thread of meaning in the hollow that the Dyer attic had left behind. Candles flickered in the draughty chapel, their glow licking the rafters like tongues of restless flame. The minister, Reverend Amos Halloway, stood stiff at the pulpit, his thin hands clutching the Bible as if it were the only solid thing left in the world. He cleared his throat, his eyes sweeping the congregation. There was no warmth in his gaze, only a deep, searching weight, as though he was looking not at them but through them. "Brothers and sisters," he began, voice low yet carrying to the back pews. "There are moments in a community's life when the line between heaven and hell grows thin. And I tell you, that line has been crossed in Dyer's Hollow." No one shifted. The cold wind rattled the stained glass windows, but it could not compete with the minister's words. "You speak of storms, of locked doors, of footsteps that vanish in the snow," he continued, "but I speak of something else, sin unconfessed, darkness invited. The devil does not take without a door being opened to him, and someone in this very town has held it wide." Gasps ripple ed through the room. Mrs. Elwood clutched her shawl tighter. Farmer Jensen's jaw tightened. The Reverend's voice rose, not in anger, but in terrible conviction. "Mark me, 19 innocent souls do not vanish unless the soil they sleep upon is already poisoned." He stepped away from the pulpit, pacing slowly, eyes darting to faces in the crowd. "Some of you have heard scratching in the walls, whispers in the night. Some of you have seen things and kept them locked behind your teeth, hoping silence would save you. But silence is consent in the devil's work." A murmur broke out. Fragments of the attic's rumors now escaping into the air, carried on trembling voices. The Reverend slammed his Bible shut. "You think this is over? It has only begun. The snow has sealed us in, but the evil is here with us, and unless we cleanse ourselves of it, more will be taken. Perhaps tonight." A baby began to cry. Somewhere, someone whispered a prayer, and in that moment the church no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a warning. They said the smell came first, a faint, bitter scent of burnt resin rising from the attic each time a nail was pulled from the old boards. Carpenters from the next town over had been called in to repair the damage from the winter storm, to seal the frost and stop the drafts. But with every plank they pried loose, their expressions changed, their eyes narrowing as though they were listening for something beneath the hammer blows. The first man to see it was named Lowell Grant. He had been replacing a rotted beam near the northwest corner when his chisel slipped and shaved off a splintered edge. Beneath the rough pine grain, darker grooves emerged, deliberate, straight, and deep, like the work of a patient hand. He called the others over. They began to scrape away more wood, each curl of pine revealing something stranger, letters, numbers, and shapes. Not words in English, not even in a language any of them could place. Some marks looked like spirals that doubled back onto themselves, others like crude figures with too many arms. In between were tallies, precise groups of 19, carved over and over. By the third beam they stopped joking. The carvings weren't just near the walls, they were inside them, hidden where no light could reach, where no child could easily have drawn. One man swore he found faint scorch marks tracing the same patterns, as if the wood itself had been burned from within. Another, a veteran of the last border war, turned pale and muttered that they looked like the sigils his unit had seen in an abandoned mission, a place no one had dared sleep in twice. When the workmen brought down a section of beam to show the constable, townsfolk crowded around it in silence. The grooves seemed deeper in the cold light of day, and if one stared long enough the shapes seemed to shift, a trick of shadow, some said, but others whispered it was no trick at all. No one knew who had carved them or why they had been hidden behind the attic walls, but as the wind rattled the windows of the town hall where the beam was kept, a woman swore she heard it, faint, irregular, almost like scratching, and someone quietly noted. The marks were fresh. The widow sat alone in the far corner of the meeting hall, a faded shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, her hands trembling not from the cold, but from memory. She had not spoken much in years, and yet, as the murmur of fearful speculation filled the room, her voice rose, dry and unsteady, but carrying an authority that silenced even the most agitated tongues. She told them she had lived in this town her entire life, long before most of the faces now staring at her were born. And she had seen this before, not in the Dyer home, but in another, a homestead that had stood on the outskirts, now long since rotted into the earth. She was only a girl then, she said, barely old enough to carry a bucket of water from the well when the whisper first spread. All the children were gone. It had happened in winter too, a night of heavy snow, the wind pressing against the windows like a living thing. But the family, she swore, had been together in the evening. Neighbors passing by saw the children at the table, their faces lit by the yellow glow of a single lamp. And then, by morning, they were gone. No footprints, no broken glass, just silence. The widow's eyes narrowed, her voice dropping low as she said that the old place had an attic too, and that strange noises were often heard there in the weeks before the vanishing. Scratches in the night, whispers under the floorboards, and once, she said, her own father had caught sight of a dim light behind the attic's shutter long after the family had gone to bed. No one ever found the children, not a shoe, not a scrap of fabric. The house stood empty for years until a storm collapsed its roof. But, and here she paused, glancing toward the Dyer family, she remembered something else. The father of that family, days before his children disappeared, had received a delivery from out of town. A large, heavy chest, locked. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The parallels were too many. The locked chest, the attic noises, the snowstorm. The widow shook her head slowly, as though the weight of the truth was too heavy to speak outright. "You think this is the first time?" she said at last, her voice cracking. "It's not. The snow keeps the secrets, and the secrets always come back." The minister shifted uneasily. The Dyers sat rigid, and in the farthest corner, the widow's eyes drifted toward the ceiling, as if, even now, she expected to hear the faint sound of scratching above. It began as whispers, then as quiet agreements between fathers over tankards of ale, and finally as an unspoken law. No child in Dyer's Crossing would sleep unwatched again. That winter, the streets at night glowed with the dim, wavering light of lanterns hung in windows, a makeshift constellati, on against the black. Men took shifts, rifles across their knees, rocking slowly in creaking chairs, eyes fixed on their children's beds. Mothers sat near fireplaces pretending to mend or read scripture, but their gaze lingered always on the smallest faces in the room. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from. The truth here is darker than most can bear. The cold made it worse. Every sound carried in the frozen air, the groan of settling wood, the snap of a branch under snow, the faint moan of wind curling around the eaves. Each noise was a question. Was that the house? Was that a step? Some swore they heard scratching, not from outside, but from inside the walls, thin, persistent, sometimes near the floors, sometimes high above, where the attic windows stared black and empty into the night. A farmer named Matthew Bell claimed he saw movement there, the suggestion of a shape passing behind the glass, too tall for a child, too still for a man. Children were given new rules: no speaking after dark, no approaching windows, no dreams whispered aloud, for fear that it, whatever it was, could hear. One night, a boy named Nathan slipped from his bed to get water. He said he saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway, lit by the moon through a window. Not his father, not anyone he knew, and when the boy blinked, just once, it was gone, leaving nothing but the smell of cold earth. The fear grew into a ritual. Every household in Dyer's Crossing barred its attic door. Some even nailed them shut. But there were always those who felt it would not be enough, that the thing which took the Dyer children needed no door to enter. By February, the men no longer spoke of if it would happen again, only when. And each night's watch grew heavier with that knowledge, the rifles in their laps like crosses in the hands of the condemned, the post. Man, a wiry man with frostbitten cheeks, had been reluctant to make the trip that morning. Snowdrifts came up to his knees, and the wind stung like knives. Yet he had a duty, and this envelope, sealed in thick, waxy red and bearing a Boston postmark, seemed important enough to deliver despite the weather. He handed it to Samuel Dyer without a word, just a curt nod, and walked away into the swirling flurries. The paper was heavy, expensive, the sort used by bankers or men of influence. Across the front, in a hand both elegant and sharp, was written, "For Samuel Dyer, Private." Mrs. Dyer noticed the change in her husband's expression as soon as he saw it. His jaw tightened and a shadow crossed his face. Instead of opening it at the table, he stepped outside, disappearing behind the barn where the wind tore at his coat. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from, because what was inside that envelope would later be whispered about for years in backrooms and taverns. When he returned, the letter was gone. He claimed it was nothing, a routine matter, but his eyes told another story. Later that day, a scrap of the same parchment was found near the chicken coop, caught under a frozen plank. Only a few words were legible. "Debts remain. Your promises mean nothing. The children." The rest was torn away, the ink smudged with what looked like melted snow, or perhaps something darker. Neighbors began to speculate. Some said Samuel had dealings with men in Boston who would ruin him if he failed to pay. Others whispered of stranger debts, not measured in coin, but in flesh. One old man at the general store swore he saw a tall figure in a dark coat standing on the ridge that very evening, watching the Dyer home from afar. No tracks were found in the snow afterward, but the memory of that silhouette lingered like a bad taste. Inside the Dyer house, the mood shifted. The children, usually noisy and lively, played quietly that night. Mrs. Dyer's hands shook as she set the supper table, and Samuel B. hardly touched his food. He excused himself early, retreating to the attic for reasons he did not share, and above them all, in that drafty upper room, the wind rattled the shutters as if impatient to get in, or to let something out. The blizzard did not relent. It thickened, hardened, and seemed to grow aware of the town's fear. Snowdrifts rose past the windowsills of the Dyer home, bending fences beneath their weight. The air was no longer just cold. It was cutting, dry enough to split skin. Days passed without the sound of a single wagon wheel. The road to the next settlement might as well have been the far side of the ocean. Inside the Dyer home, firewood dwindled. The walls creaked as though under some immense, unseen pressure. Conversation between the adults turned sharp, brittle, small disagreements swelling into full arguments. Neighbors who once shared bread and kind words now eyed each other with suspicion, muttering about who had last seen the children and whose story didn't quite align. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from, because here, in the heart of that New England winter, the very idea of community was beginning to splinter. At the town's center, the meeting house bell rang less often, not for prayer or gathering, but for warnings. One farmer claimed his dogs had vanished overnight, their tracks in the snow stopping as suddenly as the children's had. Another swore that when the wind rose at night, he could hear voices in it, not cries, but murmured conversations in a language he did not know. By mid-January, it was no longer only the Dyer family who felt trapped. Everyone was imprisoned in their own homes, staring at the same unbroken white horizon. The air inside the houses grew heavy, the smell of burning pine thick, clinging to clothes and hair. Some whispered that the weather itself was unnatural, that storms in years past had been harsh but not deliberate. And still, no one could speak of the attic without lowering their voice. Those who had been inside since the disappearance avoided describing what they'd felt there, a stillness not like peace, but like a pause before something irreversible. The snow, in its endless fall, was no longer just weather. It had become a wall, and behind that wall, the Dyers were not the only ones unraveling. It was the gravedigger, old Caleb Turner, who first raised the alarm. He had been tasked with clearing the snow from the churchyard path after a week of bitter storms, his shovel biting into the frozen crust of ice. The ground was locked tight in winter's grip, but one patch near the far edge of the cemetery lay strangely sunken, as if the earth had been disturbed from beneath. Caleb, muttering about frost heave, jabbed his spade into the spot, only to find the frozen dirt oddly loose. By mid-morning, a group of men gathered around, their breath steaming in the cold, boots crunching in the brittle snow. Reverend Collins oversaw the digging with a grim expression, his gloved hands clenched behind his back. The name carved into the weathered headstone was faint but legible, Abigail Dyer, 1819 to 1834. One of the old family. The frozen soil gave way in chunks, and when the coffin was finally pried up, the men were silent. The lid, though nailed shut decades ago, bore fresh scrape marks, like it had been pried from within, and when the nails were pulled and the wood split open, the truth lay bare. There was no body inside, only the impression of a small form in the discolored lining, and a handful of something brittle and white in the corner. A single tooth, perhaps human. The air in the churchyard turned heavier, the sound muffled as if the snow had swallowed the world whole. Reverend Collins muttered a prayer, but the words trembled as though he feared who or what might be listening. No one could explain it. There had been no signs of digging from above, no footprints, no displaced snow. The grave had been marked and untouched for over 40 years, and yet there it was, a coffin meant to hold the dead, holding nothing at all. The older townsfolk began to whisper of the hollow sleep, an old seafaring superstition about the dead who rise when called by certain voices. Some claimed it was a sign the Dyer children had not been taken by earthly means. Others muttered darker things, that Abigail had never truly died, only lain in wait for the snow to return. As the men replaced the coffin and shoveled the earth back, no one spoke aloud what they were all thinking, that whatever had happened in the attic might not have started there. It might have started here decades earlier beneath the frozen ground. The wind had died to a faint hiss, leaving the ridge above the Dyer home stark and silent. It was a grey afternoon, the sky low and heavy, when Matthew Bell and a few others noticed something strange in the snow. At first it appeared as shadows, long and thin, cutting through the drifts. But as they approached, the shapes resolved into patterns, deliberate, precise, and impossible to ignore. The markings were arranged in a circle, roughly 20 feet across, etched deep into the snow. Lines connected odd symbols, spirals, jagged triangles, and figures that resembled letters from no known language. Each symbol was repeated, forming a sequence that seemed to radiate outward from a central point, as if the snow itself had been drawn like parchment for some unseen hand. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from, because no explanation could account for what followed. The men compared their steps, measured the distances, yet there were no footprints leading to or from the hill. The snow had fallen untouched on top of the markings in some places, and the wind had shifted, scattering the powder in OT. Hers, but the symbols themselves remained intact, carved deeply as if etched from beneath the surface. One of the farmers, an older man named Silas Horn, claimed he could feel a vibration in the ground, subtle but persistent, like the land itself was humming beneath their boots. He pointed to the center of the circle. "Stand there," he said quietly. "I feel it. There." No one dared. The hollow silence of the ridge pressed down on them, heavier than the snow or the clouds above. Even the dogs, brought along as companions, whimpered, their ears flattened, refusing to step close. When they returned to the village and told their neighbors, disbelief mingled with dread. Some believed it was the work of the Dyers themselves, a message or warning left in the storm's aftermath. Others whispered that the children, or something far older, far darker, had moved across the ridge in the night, leaving the symbols as a trace of their passage. By evening, the snow had begun to drift again, softening the edges of the strange carvings, but the memory of them lingered, burning into the minds of those who had seen them, and for many in Dyer's Hollow, the ridge would never again be a place of quiet walks or pleasant views. It was a reminder that the world could shift in ways unseen, and that whatever haunted the Dyer house had the power to leave marks far beyond its walls. The Dyer home had grown quieter than ever. The snow outside pressed against the windows like a solid wall, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Inside, the few remaining members of the household huddled together, eyes darting to the attic stairs as if expecting them to move on their own. It was Mary Dyer, the youngest of the children who had somehow survived the storm, who finally spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, trembling as she clutched the hem of her shawl. The room fell silent, every ear straining to catch the words that had been held for so long. I saw them, and I tried," she gasped, tears streaming down her pale face. She swallowed, struggling to force the words through a throat tight with fear. "It wasn't meant to be. I didn't." Her eyes widened in sudden terror. The breath caught in her chest, and her knees buckled. She fell forward, lips still moving in silent desperation, a strangled sound escaping that no one could decipher. Her small body hit the floor, and within moments she was still. The room erupted in horror. Mrs. Dyer fell to her knees, pressing her hands to her daughter's face in disbelief, while Samuel Dyer's face was a mask of shock and something darker, something like guilt. The surviving servants could only stand frozen as the truth began to settle like dust in the cold air. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from, because what Mary tried to reveal would never be fully known. Neighbors and family later recalled the scene in hushed, fearful whispers. Some swore that her last words had been interrupted by a presence in the room, something felt more than seen, a pressure that pressed down, squeezing the breath from the living. Others claimed that a faint, acrid smell like burnt pine and iron lingered long after she fell silent. No one attempted to move her for fear of awakening whatever had silenced her. Reverend Halloway was summoned, and he performed rites quickly, his voice shaking as he spoke prayers over the tiny, trembling form. Yet even he admitted later that the air in the house had not lifted. It still felt heavy, watchful, and waiting. Mary Dyer's half-spoken confession became a ghost in the minds of the townsfolk. They would debate what she had meant for decades, but no one could ever hear it in full. The secret remained locked in the Dyer home, entwined with the snow, the attic, and the lingering dread that had followed the family from the very beginning. By the end of that bitter January, Dyer's Hollow was no longer a Syed, Ingle, unified community. The disappearance of the children, the empty grave, the symbols on the ridge, and Mary Dyer's final stifled confession had fractured the town into opposing factions. Fear had become ideology, and suspicion a currency more valuable than trust. One group gathered at the meeting house led by Reverend Halloway and a handful of older, steady-handed townsfolk. They spoke quietly but firmly, insisting the Dyers were victims of forces beyond human comprehension. The storms, the strange markings, the empty coffins, they said these were warnings from God or curses rooted deep in the land. They argued for compassion, prayer, and vigilance, urging the town to protect the remaining Dyers rather than condemn them. Across the street, in the warmth of the general store, another faction festered. Here the voices were louder, sharper, fueled by anger and fear. They accused Samuel and Mercy Dyer of hidden sins, of bargaining with dark powers, of keeping the children in the attic to satisfy unknown horrors. The chest, the attic carvings, the snow-patterned symbols, they claimed these were evidence of deliberate acts, not accidents. Every whispered rumor, every unexplained scratch was framed as proof. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from, because by this moment the town itself had become a battleground. Neighbors who once shared bread now crossed the street to avoid one another. Families refused to speak across fences. Children were kept inside, doors bolted, windows shuttered. Meetings meant for discussion became shouting matches. Arguments spilled into taverns and kitchens, and even the minister's sermons could not calm the tension. Some of the older residents tried to mediate, reminding others of shared history and long winters weathered together, but their words fell on ears too full of fear. Each unexplained sound at night, each shadow in the snow, fueled the fire. Soon the town was no longer thinking about what had happened to the children. It was thinking about whom to blame. In Dyer's Hollow, trust had fractured as completely as the frozen roads. Every glance became suspect, every whispered story a potential threat. The hollow, already hemmed in by snow and wind, now bore a far deeper isolation, a community divided, unsure if their enemy was outside, or standing right beside them. February 3rd came with a brittle moon, its pale light sliding across the snow like cold silver. The wind was still, but the world felt heavier, as though the hollow itself held its breath. The Dyer home sat silent, its dark windows staring blankly across the yard. Every family in town had doubled their night watches, yet no one dared approach too closely. It began just past midnight. From the ridge above, some of the patrolling townsfolk saw it first, a flicker of light in the Dyer attic, small, wavering, and golden, as if oil lamps had been lit inside. But every window on the lower floors remained dark, every door firmly shut, and the snow around the house bore no tracks. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from, because the lights that night would be remembered as the most inexplicable event in Dyer's Hollow history. The watchers grabbed lanterns and hurried across the snow, hearts hammering, the air cracking with cold. As they reached the house, the flickering stopped, leaving only the normal darkness behind the attic panes. They banged on the door, shouted into the wind, and even shook the shutters, but no answer came. Not a sound, not a shadow. Some claimed they saw the light return, gliding from one window pane to another, as if someone, or something, was moving above them. Others swore it was not just light, but shapes behind the glass, small figures, shifting quickly, too tall for children, too nimble for adults. Inside the hollow, families clutched their children closer, even those who had dismissed Perez. Evious rumors could not explain the phenomenon. Dogs whimpered, and the few brave souls who dared peer into the snowbound yard swore the air seemed to hum, a vibration too faint to feel, yet impossible to ignore. By dawn, the lights had vanished, leaving only the imprint of terror in the hearts of those who had watched. No footprints, no evidence, nothing tangible. Only the memory of motion where nothing should have moved. The next morning, the hollow buzzed with whispers. Some said the Dyers had returned somehow, in the dead of night. Others insisted that the lights were a warning, a sign that whatever had taken the children was not done. The boundary between the living and the vanished had never felt thinner. And for the first time, the town realized the mystery of the Dyer attic was no longer confined to the family. It had begun to reach into every home, every watchful eye, every snow-covered street in the hollow. By mid-morning, the curiosity and fear in the hollow had reached a fever pitch. A group of townsfolk, armed with hammers and chisels, gathered once more in the Dyer attic. The snowstorm had eased, but the house remained tense and still, as if it too were watching. Every creak of the floorboards sounded louder than it should, echoing in the empty rafters like a warning. The focus was on a section of floor near the far wall, a board that seemed slightly raised, worn differently than the others. Samuel Dyer claimed it had always been loose, yet no one had dared pry it up. The group worked slowly, tapping and chiseling, revealing the faint odor of earth beneath the pine. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from, because what lay beneath would shift everything the town believed. When the board was finally removed, it revealed a hollow cavity carved into the framing of the house. Inside lay 19 small bundles, each wrapped in rough cloth tied tightly with cord. Unlike the chest found weeks before, these bundles contained no personal belongings. Instead, each held a single object: a lock of hair, a carved wooden figure, a fragment of parchment with symbols matching those carved into the beams. More chilling, the bundles were arranged in a precise circle, echoing the patterns found on the ridge in the snow. In the center of the cavity was a small, irregular indentation, the size of a child's hand, pressed deeply into the wood. The impression had been long hidden, unnoticed until now, as if waiting for the right moment to be revealed. The room went silent. Even the men who had braved the blizzards and the empty coffins felt a new weight settle over them. Reverend Halloway whispered prayers under his breath, but the words seemed hollow in the presence of this discovery. No footprints led to or from the attic. No tools capable of carving or arranging the bundles had been found. The air smelled faintly of pine and something metallic, like blood, long dried but never fully cleansed. For the first time, the townsfolk understood that this was not merely an accident, nor even a supernatural visitation. Someone, or something, had been deliberately orchestrating the presence of these objects, creating signs, leaving clues, and guiding the investigation toward a truth none of them were prepared to face. And above it all, the snow still pressed against the windows, silent and unyielding, as if guarding the secrets that had already begun to unravel the fragile town. By mid-February, Dyer's Hollow had begun to empty. One family at a time, carts creaked over frozen roads, children bundled tightly against the cold, while mothers and fathers cast anxious glances back at the snowbound houses they had called home for decades. Whispers followed them like shadows: the chest, the attic carvings, the empty grave, and the lights that moved behind windows. Each tale added weight to the growing conviction that the hollow itself was cursed. Those who stayed watched the exodus with mounting dread. Windows that had once framed cheerful scenes now stared like black eyes, reflecting the fear of a town unraveling. Neighbors who had huddled together for warmth and solidarity now closed doors and bolted shutters, even against the midday sun. Children, when they dared to speak, whispered about shadows that lingered in the corners, shapes in the snow that disappeared when approached. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from. Because as the hollow emptied, it became clear that fear could move faster than snow or wind. Samuel and Mercy Dyer remained, their faces drawn and pale, tending to the remnants of the household. Each passing day brought fewer voices, fewer footsteps in the snow, and a heavier silence. Even the livestock seemed subdued, eyes wide and ears back, sensing the shift in the land's atmosphere. Rumors spread beyond the hollow. Travelers returning to nearby towns spoke of empty houses and abandoned carts, of footprints that led nowhere, and of a wind that seemed to carry whispers, perhaps warnings, from the north. Merchants refused deliveries. Postmen hesitated to cross the hollow's frozen roads. By the time the last family departed, the town was little more than a skeleton of what it had been, buried beneath snow and rumor alike. The Dyer's home, once a hub of activity and charity, stood silent. Its windows reflected the low grey sky, and the attic, where 19 children had vanished, loomed over the empty streets like a sentinel of secrets. Those who fled never returned, speaking only in hushed tones about the cursed hollow, the lights in the attic, and the feeling of being watched even after miles of empty wilderness lay between them and the town. And in the quiet that followed, one truth became unavoidable. Dyer's Hollow had ceased to be merely a place of human habitation. It had become a place of fear, of legend, and of something that none would dare name aloud. Nearly 2 centuries have passed, Yet the Dyer home still stands at the edge of the hollow, weathered and bowed by countless winters, its timbers grey and splintered. Travellers on the narrow, winding road slow instinctively as they pass, some claiming an unease too heavy to name. The snow that once concealed the footprints and signs of vanished children has long since melted, but the air around the house carries a chill no sun can banish. Locals speak of it in hushed tones. They tell of lights that flicker in the attic long after sunset, though no family resides there. Windows are shuttered, but on rare nights, observers swear they see movement behind the glass, a shadow crossing the pane, a flash of small figures just beyond clear view. Some claim to hear faint scratching and whispers carried on the wind, echoing the stories handed down through generations. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from, because even now, the house holds secrets that the snow, the years, and the exodus could not bury. Tourists who venture too close often report a cold so sudden it numbs the fingers and face, and a sense of being watched that follows them for hours afterward. Children are warned never to approach the old attic window, and even seasoned locals avoid it after dusk. A few brave souls who dared peek through the glass have sworn they saw bundles or objects that seemed to shift when unobserved, echoing the attic's original mysteries. Some historians have catalogued the Dyer family, the disappearances, and the strange carvings, but even their records cannot account for the lingering dread. The Hollow has become a legend, a cautionary tale of vanished children, spectral lights, and the impossibility of knowing what truly occurred. Visitors often leave quickly, their footsteps crunching on the frost, glancing back at the sagging roof as if it might rise to follow them. And when the wind rattles the shutters or a shadow flickers behind the broken panes, those who remain understand what the old-timers have always known. The Dyer attic keeps its secrets well. The house endures, a silent witness to the past, a monument to fear, and a reminder that some mysteries are never meant to be solved. The Hollow sleeps, but it is never still, and the attic waits, patient for the next eyes to peer too closely, for the next hand to pry at the floorboards, for the past to stir once more.